Good evening. Um, I would like to welcome you all this evening to this symposium on Thomas Fow's Minding the Modern. My name is William Junker. I am an assistant professor of Catholic Studies at the University of St. Thomas and the co-director of the Terence J. Murphy Institute for Catholic Thought, Law, and Public Policy. Um, my other co-director, Lisa Schiltz, represents the law school. Is Lisa here yet? No, she's coming. The traffic is bad. Um, what I would like to do is first introduce uh, the panel briefly, as well as Professor Fow, and then we will proceed to several responses to Professor Fow's arguments in Minding the Modern, followed by a response to those responses. Let me say first something about Professor Fow. We are very privileged to have Thomas Fow with us tonight. Thomas Fow is the Bass Fellow and Alice Mary Baldwin Professor of English and Associate Professor and Chair of Germanic Languages with an appointment in the Divinity School at Duke University. He is also, to the best of my knowledge, one person. Fow was trained as a scholar of German and English Romanticism, and his first two books, Wordsworth's Profession and Romantic Moods, are excellent instances of the type. His third book, however, Minding the Modern, the focus for our symposium tonight, represents a different kind of scholarship and a much different scope than his earlier two. Minding the Modern is untimely in the best sense. Its arguments cut across disciplinary and historical divisions of professional scholarship to reveal a truth that those divisions work to conceal. This explains why the attention the book has thus far received has not always been adequate to its object. The categories most of us have been trained to use in analyzing such a work are often the very ones its argument displaces. Minding the Modern cannot be placed, really, along the supposed divide between the pre-modern and the modern, or between the religious and the secular. Instead, the book draws our attention primarily to two competing understandings of human thought and agency. The first thinks of reason as a kind of calculation of means to ends that are themselves not given by reason, but by instinct or desire or genes or preferences or committee reports. The second, however, thinks of reason as caught up in a longer and larger history of its own prior acts. On this conception, the textual past and memory of prior acts of reason is the condition for responsible thinking in the present and the warrant for any future it might possess. Fow's book sketches the lineaments of both conceptions of reason as they recur throughout the long history of European intellectual culture. And it makes a powerful claim that if there is to be a future for the humanities, then the past cannot be forgotten within the present, but must be reanimated constantly from its perspective. In responding to Professor Fow's book, I'm grateful to have four of my colleagues from the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of St. Thomas. The first respondent will be Professor Erica Kidd from Catholic Studies. The second respondent will be Professor Young-Ok Ahn from the Department of English. The third will be Raymond McKenzie from the Department of English. And the fourth will be Professor Mark McEnroy from the Department of Theology. We like to end with the Queen of the Sciences. Please join me in welcoming then Professor Fow and the respondents. And please hold your applause, no matter how good each individual response is. Please hold your responses, your applause to the end of the session. So, you can read from there or here.
Good evening. Thank you all for being here. As my co-respondents will probably echo, it's a little difficult to know how to respond to an 800-page book in 5 pages, but I'll do my best. And what occurred to me to do is to tell, in response to Fou's grand narrative, a very small narrative of my own, or rather of Augustine's. So, one of the delights of Fou's book is that he manages to spin out so many variations on his theme, most times leaving the reader with the sense that the current key is in fact the very key most suited to that theme. And yet the variations are far from redundant. Each catches a new angle. My own attunement is Augustinian, and in my remarks today, I'm going to linger over that particular iteration of Fou's theme, adding my own little sympathetic cadenza. Substantial parts of the narrative Fou wants to tell about modernity, its ancestors, its development, and worthy ways forward, can be writ small in the life and writings of Augustine. Therefore, I offer 3 pivotal Augustinian vignettes, 3 scenes Fou does not dwell on, but which can help enliven our imaginations for both the alienation and the hope he describes. These 3 scenes will focus and integrate my reflection on Fou's vast and detailed project. In particular, I want to reflect on his Augustinian contention that, quote, willing is profoundly enmeshed with self-awareness, end quote, where self-awareness is understood as distinct from self-possession. Scene 1. Augustine's confessions are his attempt to speak with and about God, and he opens them by reflecting on how he learned to speak about anything at all. In Book 1, he describes himself as a preternaturally observant infant who initiates himself into language by carefully observing how the speakers around him affix labels to the objects in his world, objects he deeply desires. By observing the gestures, expressions, and tones of voice of these speakers, Augustine says his child self taught himself the language he needed to express the thoughts of his heart and declare his wishes. I'm far from the first to observe that Augustine's description as an account of the actual movement from infans, one who doesn't speak, to chattering boy is quite strange. It is also, I submit, rather modern in Fou's sense. It is an image of a desperately attempted self-possession, a discipline from which the child will gradually, over the course of the confessions, finally be freed. That child's basic relation to the world is one of possession. All that it needs to know is that it wants things, and that words are the tools for securing those things. This narrow way of apprehending the world is a picture of what Fou terms a quintessentially modern fantasy, quote, the libido dominandi's conclusive possession of all phenomena, rather than letting them speak and conceiving knowledge as our adequatio to and participation in them, end quote. Modernity has what we might call an immature or childish way of grasping, rather, a childish grasping way of encountering the phenomena it encounters. Denying its relatedness to those phenomena, it embraces a posture of estrangement in the hope such a discipline will yield the narrow results it seeks. In the case of modernity, that hope aims at a knowledge unperverted by human entanglements, such as beliefs, commitments, moral obligations, virtues, and so on. The cogito knows best, it supposes, by attaching neutral labels to the objects it encounters so that they can be summoned as the mind chooses, according to its fancy. Childish, too, in Augustine's portrait is the arbitrariness of willing, itself another feature of Fou's modern will. As Augustine admits, the child he describes wants what it wants when it wants, even though the adult Augustine acknowledges that the child may have wanted badly. The child is overcome by his wanting, which comes as an almost external compulsion, not governed by anything like an Aristotelian teleological pursuit of the good. Furthermore, in perhaps a prototypically modern way, the child Augustine describes is strangely alienated from those around him, including those to whom it is in truth most closely related, The child sounds more or less like an orphan in Augustine's telling. Quote, he says, "Thus I learned to express my needs to the people among whom I lived, and they made their wishes known to me." End quote. That's the child Augustine talking. There is for this poor child no strong sense of relatedness to others, and more importantly, no sense that others might inform the child's sense of how to engage with the world. Thus, the child, sunk in its own mind, remains outside of the salutary dialectical process described by Fouw, whereby concepts are received, rethought, and transmitted to future generations. The child is oddly self-possessed and thereby deeply alienated. Scene 2. As Fouw notes, Augustine takes up the Stoic insight that the mind can become attached to and enslaved to the images and illusions it projects. This attachment is what Augustine calls sin. The path to the blessed life involves learning to develop distance from those projections. This is what Augustine's child needs. But Augustine parts ways with the Stoics in his recognition that such a distancing takes place not through further discipline of the will and greater feats of mental asceticism. Instead, those projections lose their hold just when Augustine is able to relax into the recognition that he is both known and loved, an insight that the Book One child seems quite far from grasping. The need for this recognition, I take it, is the heart of Books 7 and 8, Augustine's most poignantly existential engagement with the problem of the will. In Book 7, Augustine wants a meeting of the minds, his and that of the divine spirit. In Book 7, he thinks that such a tete-a-tete would give him an insight that would put his heart to rest, but in fact his ever more desperate attempts to will one thing purely are put to an end only when he hears the voice of a child, and consequently remembers the love a father has for a son, even a truly wayward one. Which is to say, his apparent problem with his will dissolves when his self-awareness becomes most honest. He loses all pretense of self-possession, throws himself under a tree, and weeps. Fouw's book is far from pessimistic and not at all nostalgic, precisely because he acknowledges that there has been no golden age of reason and humanistic thought. Concepts have always been worked out through a process of dialectic that sharpens and intensifies not just their clarity, but also, as I'm going to discuss next, the ways in which they are inextricably tied up with the lives we lead with them. While the first scene I mentioned highlights features of the critique of modernity Fouw offers, the third scene I present, Augustine and Monica's vision at Ostia, is a particularly vivid picture of the kind of humanistic inquiry Fouw takes to be the lifeblood of reason and true understanding. So, scene 3. Augustine's great insight into the blessed life, the knowledge of which he has been so desperately seeking, comes through conversation with his mother, who knows him, who made him, and who loves him. Mothers are a total embarrassment to moderns. There is in their exchange no method but charity, and their hearts spur them on to greater and greater insight. The questions they ask arise out of the life they have shared together, both the grief and the joy, and with obvious reference to Monica's expected death. This resonates with Fouw's insistent refrain that concepts are received and inflected as we attempt to respond to inherited questions, not those questions we might conceive ab novo. Augustine and Monica, unlike the ascetics of modernity, are able to remember, where remembering means engaging in the history of a concept in such a way that the knowers recognize their own implication in it. Fouw doesn't belabor the connection between concepts and that more mundane form of conceiving with which we sexual beings are familiar, but he could have. Conception is, in its simplest sense, of course, concipere, taking something in. Conception in Fouw's philosophical version works something like its physical sexual version, in that it is, he notes, responsive, common, and not spontaneously creative. Concepts need to gestate and grow. Neither human beings nor ideas burst forth from the forehead of an individual fully formed, or at least they shouldn't. But what would prompt us to want them to do so? Well, Augustine might have something to say about that, too. Rather than self-possession, Augustine invites us into self-awareness, but that self-awareness is tough. This is a quotation from Fouw. Particularly in the Confessions, self-awareness never involves the acquisition, timely or belated, of some unified object or focal point. Rather, awareness of self for Augustine almost always amounts to awareness of an indelible conflict. Indeed, it consists of the vivid, present, and all-encompassing recognition of the self as constitutively divided, rather than subject to occasional conflicted feelings, end quote. It is perhaps that nascent awareness of persistently prodigal self-division that makes it so hard for Fou's modern man to look his fellow human beings in the eye. That recognition can feel like a humiliation, though it may be the beginning of wisdom. I suspect that's why Augustine only manages it in the company of a parent. Fou tells us that rationality is not a correlate of self-possession, but of recognition. Augustine styles himself as the prodigal son whose real insight comes not once he's finally pulled himself together, but once he has recognized who he is, his father's son and his mother's too. It is that recognition that allows him honestly to reinterpret the phenomena he encounters. That just is the work of the Confessions. And if we teachers and scholars could learn to confess confess as well, cum fateor, to learn to speak with one another in ways that acknowledge the layered history of our words and concepts, as well as our own implication in them, we'd be well on our way towards the transformations of the knower Fou describes. Thank you.
My talk is titled Recovering Wonder, the Value of Literary and Critical Thinking. It is a daunting task to respond to Professor Fou's massive and far-reaching book, as Erica said, in the manner he teaches us to practice, in a speculative and hermeneutical, integrated, and ethical way. Indeed, fully meeting this urgent call would take much more time than what's given. So, prompted by Professor Billy Junker, I will address the challenges the humanities face in our modern university education, focusing on the book's Coleridge segments. I will attempt to summarize and elucidate Fou's hermeneutical reading of Coleridge, using the following questions to guide my response. What does it mean to pursue human knowledge, thinking, and action? And what has Samuel Taylor Coleridge, a British Romantic thinker author, suggested in this regard? Implied by these questions are further questions such as, what does literary education do? Or why should we read poetry? And who is this we anyway? In Minding the Modern, Fou treats Coleridge not so much as the poet as he was and is often read as, but as one who engaged in intellectual traditions in philosophy, philology, the life sciences, and theology before literary studies had branched off by the late 19th century into a hermetic pursuit. In light of our university's approach to hyper-specialized and post-metaphysical inquiry, Fou appreciates Coleridge's grand narrative design, to which his poetry is integral. The fundamental concepts Fou examines in the book are, in appearance, familiar. Concepts such as freedom, reason, human agency, action, will, and the connection between I and you. The latter term, obviously, meaning a collective purpose, or as the mission statement of St. Thomas calls it, the common good. Fou compels us to ask, do these concepts not constitute the core values of being human? In what ways do changing times affect those values? According to Fao, what we consider the characteristics of an educated person in our time is a legacy of the modern. Let's imagine a character in a narrative poem or a novel, especially from the 19th century or later. This character, a seemingly autonomous individual, yearns for freedom while seeking a meaningful connection with others and while functioning in a society reasonably well or even successfully, encounters moments of disillusionment bordering on crisis when he or she experiences reflective moments. We all know these characters and we recognize these same traits in our own lives and in those of our students. As Fao points out, a great deal of 19th century narrative scrutinizes this kind of autonomous individual's repeated failure to achieve a concept or vision of the whole, and especially of the human other as you. Behind this failure lurks a story that should never have unfolded in the first place. He notes, quote, for writers such as Blake, Goethe, Schopenhauer, Stendhal, Flaubert, Arnold, George Eliot, Dostoevsky, and Nietzsche, among others, freedom is a challenge to our capacities for imaginative vision rather than a formal possession or claim right. Yet it is a challenge that their characters rarely tend to meet successfully. Unable to achieve this vision, the individual characters ultimately surrender to the idol of knowledge as power and commodity. The recurring question for these disillusioned characters is, what value might be left for speculative thinking in a world that has embraced instrumental rationality without reserve? Indeed, while we routinely hear of and assert the importance of critical thinking, a phrase that is part of UST's mission statement, we may not engage with deep thinking or speculative thinking. The latter involves seeking integrated knowledge, not specialized, fragmented, or even discipline-specific knowledge. In fact, Fao challenges, following Coleridge's critique 2 centuries ago, the orientation of typical knowledge production. The following quote is in the handout number 1. As active members of a profession committed to and or embedded in various disciplinary and institutional pursuits and practices, we ourselves are potentially symptoms of the very modernity that Coleridge found so perturbing. First and foremost, there is the apparent fragmentation of knowledge into so many discrete institutional and disciplinary subspecializations, and along with it, the dominance of method for which Bacon, Descartes, and Newton had significantly paved the way. As Giambattista Vico, Blake, Coleridge, Goethe, Schopenhauer, among others, saw it, the gradual extension of modernity's analytical and methodical conception of science to all areas of knowledge risks fragmenting the world as a whole to the point that the resulting utterly particular insight is all but certain to have eroded the human and spiritual significance of the knowledge so obtained. Here, Fao highlights the way in which the scientific method has become the primary model of knowledge seeking. He then asks, what if our single-minded embrace of rationality as the efficient, specialized, institutional, and corporate production of knowledge were to have obscured an entirely other dimension of reason. Faust posits that it is the task and privilege of literature and criticism in the strong sense, that is extra professional sense, to pose and explore questions of this kind. We often associate imagination and creativity with the arts, including literature, music, and the visual arts, and speculative and critical thinking with philosophy, which integrates theology. How can these areas be reintegrated into our approach to knowledge seeking? Thus, what Faust suggests for us amounts to a way to rethink of liberal arts education. The following passage is number 2 in the handout. Theoria, in its classical, Platonic, and modified Aristotelian sense, had constituted an essentially individual and contemplative relation to the cosmos, one notably accompanied by a sense of wonder. Socratic dialogue and Platonic dialectics were thought to furnish the most promising form of the continued interpretation of wonder. Implicitly, the classical notion of theoria also posited that truth in its totality was at the disposition of the individual, and as a further consequence, that there had to be a strong association of eudaimonia with theory. I'll skip the rest of the passage. This sense of wonder implies some impending, all-consuming revelation. I found this passage deeply suggestive and resonant, since it points to the theoretical horizon captured in a poetical or figurative word. It also suggests the affinity between arts and sciences that is integral to Coleridgean thinking. Richard Holmes's book titled The Age of Wonder expounds on the notion of wonder that marked the minds of the modern scientists, such as Thomas Beddoes and Humphrey Davy. And as Faust implies, Coleridge was a close friend to Beddoes and frequently volunteered to be the subject of Davy's experimentations. Furthermore, the kind of integrated thinking Faust describes is not separate from action. For Coleridge, Faust notes, here's the number 3 in the handout, thought is itself a form of sustained action, though potentially unapparent to others, while it is consummated in expression. Since we have been accustomed to treating thought and action as two different categories, Coleridge's idea of thought as action may indeed seem idealistic or antiquated. Yet, the thinker is already involved in active change-making, to use the touted contemporary expression. As a complex and open-ended hermeneutic express unfolds, that process in turn enables the interpretive agent, that's us, to develop a reflexive perspective on the way in which thought frames the phenomenon at hand. Many contemporary theorists since Saussure assign language a primary role in shaping human thoughts, but Faust gives it a less prominent, though still important role. Quoting Coleridge's statement, language and all symbols give outness to thoughts, and this is the philosophical essence and purpose of language, Faust considered language integral to the crucial symbolic dimension opened up by thoughts, which develop into intellectual and moral purpose. While this understanding of thought, the notion that ethics and literary language are intertwined, was firmly within the classical tradition, it has been upended by our current models of disciplinary and institutional knowledge, which have, Fao states, implicitly embraced a wholly instrumentalized notion of production, which rests on a means to end concept of rationality and posits labor as a commodity of exchange. Thus, Fao contrasts the model of thought as action with the concept of production. Fao aligns himself with Hannah Arendt, who asserts that production is characterized as being entirely absorbed in and exhausted by the end product. Such characterization neglects to include the essential feature of human practice, whereas action is never exhausted in a single deed, but on the contrary, can grow while its consequences multiply. In the production-oriented model, the human capacity for freedom by producing the web of human relationships seems to entangle its producer to such an extent that he appears much more the victim and the sufferer than the author and doer of what he has done. Nowhere do humans appear to be less free than in those capacities whose very essence is freedom, and in that realm which owes its existence to nobody and nothing but human. Anybody who's dealing with 50 or more emails a day that understand this statement by Arendt. Fao sees this production-oriented model aligns with methodology-oriented thinking, a type of thinking he attributes to the historicist approach. This seems to me a bold move, not only because one would expect the blame to fall on utilitarianism and so on, but also because both historicism and methodology have become essential to our academic and social discourse and practice. For Fao, the historicist approach foregoes the very fundamental question about the human and spiritual significance of knowledge, or ethics or values. According to Fao, the historicist paradigm has recast knowledge as a necessarily transgenerational progression. The quote number 5, I'm going to skip it. This explanation sheds light on the tension between a historicist perspective and the metaphysical tradition Fao reclaims throughout his revaluations of and elaborations upon the grand narratives. One might posit, however, that Fao's book, Minding the Modern, incorporates a historical approach since it examines the intellectual history of modernity and its historicity. Fao depicts and examines how, for example, modern angst that we talked about stems from a disconnection from the divine in a uniquely modern sense. I'm reminded, however, that the sense of the new, breaking away from the ancient, is not an entirely modern invention. For example, in 2 Corinthians, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. Old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. If we need to differentiate this sense of the transformational moment from the self-consciousness of the modern, I wonder if historicity and historicization is always already an integrated part of a conceptual undertaking. If a historical perspective helps us raise questions that have not been asked, and thus re-examine an inherited understanding of the foundational concepts such as human personhood, some historicists would argue the drive to historicize should inform their projects, whether they actively identify themselves as historicists or not. Also, the question of a human personhood and the accompanying question of how we relate with each other have motivated human inquiry all along, what Pfau elaborates through the notion of development. And I, for one, believe that the questions about human personhood opened up by modern democratic discourse are immeasurably significant in understanding the concepts of freedom and responsibility. How to account for women, slaves, lower class people, and the subalterns, for example, who are excluded from the discourse of human will and freedom in much of pre-modern philosophy, emerged as pressure points for traditional thinking. I'm thinking of systematic slavery, sexism, racism, and colonialism that were common during classical and pre-modern times. In sum, I welcome Pfau's challenge to the modern condition and the modern paradigm, not just because he critiques this perpetually re-invoked and reaffirmed state of the new that drives us to be complicit with the logic of shrinking and isolating the humanities. Uncompromisingly, he points to an old vision that needs to be reawakened in us, invoking epiphanic revelations. Instead of resorting to modern angst and melancholy, at times jolted by packaged optimism, we need to recover actively and rigorously the often forgotten dimension of wonder of being with the other, and open ourselves to ethical responsibility, including the responsibility of inviting that wonder into our teaching of the humanities.
Good evening. I want to focus on a moment in the mid-19th century involving the French novelist Gustave Flaubert. In Minding the Modern, Professor Pfau devotes several thoughtful pages to Flaubert's great novel from 1857, Madame Bovary, or as we say in Minnesota, Madame Bovary. Many of you know the story of Emma Bovary, the young woman from a tiny farm in the middle of nowhere who grows up expecting life to be a series of passionate adventures. And when life fails her, she spirals into despair, increasing scenes of degradation and ultimately suicide. Pfau sees Emma Bovary as an archetype of the tragedy of modernity, a person marked by the radical split between reason and will. Indeed, the vitiation of the will to the point where there's no meaningful difference between willing and simply wishing, where happiness is conceived of in consumerist or erotic terms, which are usually almost the same thing. The next outfit or purchase will make me happy, Emma thinks, or maybe the next lover. This seems to me to be a good reading of the issues in Madame Bovary, and it also brings up an important paradox about Flaubert himself. Though he's often considered a quintessentially modern writer, a kind of symbol almost of the heroically dedicated craftsman, he was also a strong and insightful critic of how modernity reduces the human person. I'd like to take a moment to approach this issue from a slightly different angle. That is, I want to consider his view of the history of art and fiction, which he sketched in a letter to Louise Collet in January of 1852, when he was in the early stages of writing Madame Bovary, and that's on a handout going around, I hope. Here, writing to Collet, he says, "What seems beautiful to me, what I would most like to write, is a book about nothing, a book that is connected to nothing outside itself, one that would be held together strictly by the strength of its style, just like the earth, which, hanging suspended in space, depends on nothing external to support it. A book that would have almost no subject, or at least one where the subject would be nearly invisible, if it could be done. The finest works are those that contain the least matter. The closer that the expression comes to the thought, the closer language comes to coinciding and blending into it, the more beautiful. I believe that the future of art lies in this direction. I see it as having developed this way, becoming as ethereal as it can, from the Egyptian pylons to the Gothic lancets, from the 20,000-line poems of the Indians to the abrupt outpourings of Byron. Form, as it becomes more skillful, becomes attenuated. It leaves behind all liturgy, all rules, all measures. It abandons the epic for the novel, verse for prose. It no longer recognizes any orthodoxy and is as free as the will of each artist who produces it. This is why there's no such thing as an elevated or a degraded subject, and why one could almost set it up as an axiom that from the point of view of pure art, there is no subject. Style being in itself an absolute way of seeing things. Flaubert's emphasis on style over subject is to some extent a response to the debates of his time regarding the movement we now call realism. In painting, especially, as you probably know, realism was more controversial because of the subject it chose, the ordinary prosaic subjects of farm workers, city laborers, and so forth, more controversial about that subject than it was about its style. And as for the subject matter of Madame Bovary, that novel, well, it involves a series of petty adulteries among a set of unimportant people in a small town no one would ever care about. From the point of view of traditionally great literature, this is no subject matter at all, or at best, perhaps it could be used for low comedy. Flaubert, in fact, saw the writing of Madame Bovary as a kind of exercise he needed to perform in style, as a kind of challenge to make a beautiful work of art out of the least promising materials. His first book had been an attempt to write about the famous temptation of St. Anthony in the desert, and that was a subject to which he would return. In the course of his life, he wrote 3 different versions of his St. Anthony book. Now, St. Anthony, facing down all the demons of hell and all the weird spirits and demigods of the Mediterranean in late antiquity, that, Flaubert felt, that's a subject worthy of serious literature. The story of Emma Bovary and her temptations was excusable only as an exercise in style. Well, we need to ask what style means in this context. And without getting too technical, there's a larger point I think he's getting at here. When Flaubert calls style an absolute way of seeing things, he's suggesting that style is unique in each instance, that each artist sees differently, I suppose each person sees differently, and the style is the expression or concretization of that vision. What would bad style be, or inept style, or inartistic style? Well, it would be a style dominated by cliché, by prefabricated phrases and conventional views. And it's just here that Flaubert becomes, perhaps a little paradoxically, anti-modern, because he sees the dominance of the cliché, the accepted view, the received idea, as a hallmark of modernity. Such clichés do our thinking for us, as they do our seeing for us. They negate our individual vision, and they turn our art into something readily mass-producible, into commodity. They deaden our perceptions, and worse yet, in the modern age, we tend to welcome this deadening. Interestingly, a similar point had been made about modernity about 50 years before Flaubert in the English poet William Wordsworth's Preface to Lyrical Ballads, 1805. And Wordsworth said there seemed to be something different about the current age he was living in 1805. He said, "A multitude of causes unknown to former times are now acting with a combined force to blunt the discriminating powers of the mind, and unfitting it for all voluntary exertion to reduce it to a state of almost savage torpor. The most effective of these causes are the great national events which are daily taking place and the increasing accumulation of men in cities, where the uniformity of their occupations produces a craving for extraordinary incident, which the rapid communication of news hourly gratifies." Wordsworth goes on to indict contemporary literature for colluding in this by producing sensational and vacuous novels and plays to feed the growing appetite for mere stimulation. Of course, writing in 1805, he had no idea how much worse the situation was going to get. But Wordsworth wants poetry to play the role of undoing that process of deadening the mind, the deadening that is the hallmark of the modern urban person in an age of mass communication. Modernity for Wordsworth also involves, just as it does for Emma Bovary, and I'm going to quote Professor Faure here, an enslavement to mimetic desire and its underlying hedonistic model of agency. Poetry for Wordsworth is the same thing, I think, as what Flaubert was calling style, at least in terms of its function of arousing the mind and the perceptions instead of contributing to their sleep. In the 20th century, this claim was made again by the great Russian critic Viktor Shklovsky, who argued that the true function or role of literature is indeed defamiliarization. Shklovsky says art exists so that one may recover the sensation of life, to make one feel things, to make the stone stony. The purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they're perceived and not as they're known. Interesting distinction. The technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar. Shklovsky's idea of defamiliarization is similar to how Wordsworth saw the function of literature. There's something about modernity that deadens the perceptions. That deadening is a theme that Flaubert addresses in many of his works and his letters. He was waging a war against cliché throughout his life and works. Madame Bovary, those of you who read it know, includes a number of characters who cannot think without the ready-made phrases and the self-satisfied tones provided by received ideas and received ways of thinking. You may remember the pharmacist Homais as the leading example in Madame Bovary. But this is a subject Flaubert returned to repeatedly, most memorably in a late work called beautiful piece of satire called The Dictionary of Received Ideas, which mockingly provides the reader with just the right thing to say on any occasion. Okay? That is, it provides the reader with language misused, language that papers over truth rather than expressing it, language that obscures truth in order to further one's personal agenda. Okay? So the tension I'm trying to focus on here is that between cliché, broadly understood, and true individual style. Again, that absolute way of seeing things. Considered this way, the issue of style, as Flaubert sees it, is not simply an issue of interest to writers, but to all of us. Modern culture is always rushing in, coming between us and the world, and proffering new things to buy and new forms of entertainment, which are ways to avoid seeing what is in front of us, to avoid thinking about it, to avoid a meaningful life. Style, as Flaubert conceives it then, is a way of resisting the gravitational pull of modern culture and its numbing of the mind. Indeed, this is a major theme in that great novel, Madame Bovary, that mere exercise in style, because over and over we see people succumbing to the lure of cliché, and Emma too does, being easily swayed by the cheap romances she read as a girl, novels that got between her and any genuine examination of the world as it is. Emma's tragedy is that she's too smart. She's too insightful to go on being fooled by the consumerist, erotic paradise that the romances promise. But she's not insightful enough to build up any alternative for herself. And I don't mean that as any criticism of her, because most of us have and would have a lot of trouble constructing a rich, meaningful worldview all on our own. For that, we rely upon culture, on religion, upon tradition. But in Emma's case, her culture offers her no help whatsoever in creating a meaningful existence. And that terrible moment of epiphany, the moment when she perceives what a sham the whole erotic and commodity ideology really is, that revelation leads to her suicide. She's a fictional character, but we recognize her struggle because we've all felt it to one degree or another. And thus, Emma Bovary has become a kind of archetype of the modern self, the self that, again to quote Professor Fao, is defined via its exclusive right to access the fantasized virtual realm of economic and erotic fulfillment. So, we can begin to appreciate what Flaubert meant about saying style is an absolute way of seeing things. To return to that quote for just a minute, there's one more phrase I want to come at, invite some discussion. He says at the end of that passage, form, as it becomes more skillful, becomes attenuated. It leaves behind all liturgy, all rules, all measures. It abandons the epic for the novel, verse for prose. It no longer recognizes any orthodoxy and is as free as the will of each artist who produces it. That combination of liturgy, rules, and measures brings together quite a lot. Now, art leaving behind rules and measures is something we're all familiar with. Modern poetry has all but abandoned traditional meter and form in favor of free verse, and novels, plays, and stories that are experimental by doing without some once crucial element like plot or character or some kind of unified coherence. Such experiments have become so familiar that they seem hardly surprising anymore. But the other term Flaubert uses there, liturgy, seems to me to be the most remarkable one in his list. Literature that is liturgical. Well, I guess the first thing that suggests is the theater of ancient Greece, with its highly ritualized forms and modes, and it's being embedded literally in a site of worship before the throne of the priest of Dionysus. Liturgical literature might also suggest Homeric epic, with its often repeated epithets, the rosy-fingered dawn and wine-dark sea and so on, and its other beyond counting repetitions of phrases, sentences, passages that create a ritual-like atmosphere. The Greek dramatists and Homer could also be called liturgical because they present, in effect, what are memorials, rememberings of the great mythical and religious characters and events. Liturgy, of course, has this element of repetition. For certain kinds of repetition are a memorializing, a recalling, a reenactment. The Mass is the one modern example of modern life that we continue to get for this, a ritualized reenactment of the Last Supper, and of course in the moment of transubstantiation, a reenactment of the Incarnation itself. The liturgical involves remembering and repeating. But how could liturgical literature succeed in a world where we must be on our guard against prefabricated sloganeering, the sloganeering of commodity culture? Repetition itself becomes suspect and evidently must be purged in favor of style as an absolute way of seeing. Well, given all that, one might assume that Flaubert is prescribing a kind of radical individualism for the writer, one that evades all contact with the past or with tradition, under pain of being accused of mere repetition. But one would then be surprised to open up Madame Bovary and find within the first few pages a quotation from Virgil's Aeneid in Latin, along with a host of other classical echoes, some subtle, some explicit. That novel is highly original in almost every sense, but it's also deeply connected with the long literary tradition reaching back to the ancients. Modern Christianity comes in for some criticism in Flaubert's novel, too. A famous scene in the novel, some of you will remember, as Emma approached the village priest, desperate for spiritual advice, desperate for someone attuned to the soul and its pains. But this priest is so wrapped up in the material world that he can hardly understand her. As she tries to articulate the psychic and emotional torment which is overwhelming her, this affable, pleasant village priest seems unable to follow her. He keeps saying, well, as long as you're warm and well-fed, I don't see what could possibly be the problem. She gives up, and she leaves him in even greater despair. And as she walks away, we can hear the children in the church behind her learning their catechism. The priest's voice asks, what is a Christian? And the children in unison repeat, a Christian is one who. Flaubert's novel indicts the church, too, for having lapsed into the trough of modernity, of rote phrases rather than real understanding, of a satisfied materialism and a deadened sensibility to spiritual pain. But that very indictment implies the contrast, doesn't it? Implies that there can be and ought to be a vital church, one less concerned with memorizing catechisms and one ready actually to listen to the suffering souls like Emma who come to it for help. Well, Emma is in the predicament of modernity, seeking meaning in a culture that denies the very quest. Flaubert's novel, his exercise in style, allows us to see the things the way they are, and by implication to remember perhaps how they were, and to imagine how they might be. That contrast is vivid enough to awaken our own perceptions, to defamiliarize what we've grown to accept as natural and normal. The book and Flaubert's way of seeing strikes me as more important today than ever. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming. I would like to open by thanking Thomas Fowle for his extraordinary book. In Minding the Modern, he offers penetrating assessments of an exceptionally broad range of figures, including Aristotle, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, William of Ockham, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Bernard Mandeville, Francis Hutcheson, David Hume, Adam Smith, John Henry Newman, and, of course, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. What results is a breathtaking tour de force that makes the need for humanistic inquiry acutely felt in our present intellectual environment. My remarks will be directed toward Fowle's reading of John Henry Newman's essay on development, and I ultimately want to ask if certain criticisms that have been leveled on Newman might also be raised in response to Fowle's frequently Newmanian account of the manner in which ideas develop in intellectual traditions. To begin, Fowle regards Newman as an ally in his efforts at refocusing humanistic inquiry away from, in Fowle's words, philosophies that peremptorily exclude all questions of value, commitment, and final causes. For example, modern science-driven epistemologies, reductionist accounts of mind, or the logical minimalism of much analytic philosophy. To Fowle, such views are deficient in that they are by and large incapable of correlating thought and existence, life and action, for they only attend to the propositional structure of our locutions, in as far as these seem to lead to some kind of outcome. Although this mindset is frequently viewed as quintessentially modern, Fowle locates its origins in the 14th century voluntarism of William of Ockham. As a corrective, Fowle holds that humanistic inquiry can never be reduced to an aggregate of interconnected, logical propositions, let alone to a utopian emancipation from the past. Instead, the movement of an idea is necessarily transgenerational, intersubjective, and materially concrete. It involves not a mind in isolation, a Lockean idea of a punctual self, but rather the whole living person who is situated within the tradition he or she examines. Put simply, humanistic inquiry involves the human, by which we mean here the whole human being, replete with, among many other things, a history and a community. A necessary component of this more holistic form of inquiry is a different attitude toward the past than that fetishized by the modern mind. Rather than categorically viewing tradition askance because of the likelihood that it will impose heteronomy on the individual self, Fowle, using Newman, calls for the following. Ideas and conceptions are received on trust, and as such stand to be compared, sorted, sifted, selected. In short, to be engaged dialogically, interpersonally, and in ways bound to transform both the knower and the known. Critique itself should be exercised critically, not as an automatic, unthinking response to any idea that is not one's own. As Fowle puts it, again drawing from Newman, the first step in any legitimate intellectual progression must be one of assent, not to a proposition or opinion, but to the truth of the phenomenon's sheer givenness. Just to be able to doubt is no warrant for disbelieving. Not only should we let ideas in more graciously than is our modern wont, to Fowle and Newman, we need not keep our own preconceptions out in an attempt to evaluate ideas in a supposedly pure, objective, and unbiased manner. Newman here anticipates Gadamer in holding that antecedent conditions, closely akin to Gadamer's Vorverständnis or pre-understanding, constitute a necessary backdrop without which judgments could not be made at all. Prejudice does not disqualify one from issuing judgments, as the modern mind would insist. Instead, prejudice enables the very act of judging in the first place. To Fowle and Newman, then, ideas enter into dialogue with persons in specific historical locations who hold pre-existing commitments that necessarily shape their engagement with those ideas. What ensues is development, not as some inexorable deduction of consequences from a single premise, as Fowle puts it, but instead as a non-teleological, yet dynamic process. In other words, ideas do not develop in the same way that premises inevitably lead to a conclusion, as in syllogistic reasoning. Instead, as ideas are carried beyond their initial provenance, they encounter unpredictable foreign elements determined by the soil in which they happen to take root. Those who espouse an idea may need to respond to unanticipated critiques or supplementations. And in many cases, external aspects will be assimilated into the original idea, As Pfau summarizes Newman, a process of development gradually fleshes out, fills in, and so realizes the meaning and significance of a specific and at first cryptic idea or motif. This open-ended process is crucial not only for the idea to mature, but also for its truth to be discerned. As Pfau puts this point, filled with intellectual struggle, conflict, and trial, the passage of historical time thus exposes, in ways that no syllogistic method ever can, the deeper semantic strata of an idea, and in so doing, attests to the antecedent probability of that idea's truth by acknowledging its undiminished capacity for engaging and transforming individuals and communities. How shall we assess Pfau's view of tradition and development? As an initial response, we must acknowledge that his is a much more satisfying understanding of how traditions of thought actually work than the so-called logical theories of development opposed by Newman and his followers. Indeed, Pfau's account persuasively demonstrates the indispensability of robustly humanistic inquiry for an adequate investigation of the intellectual traditions that shape our most deeply held convictions. And yet, Newman's theory of development was arguably haunted by the difficulty of articulating adequate criteria by which true development could be distinguished from false corruptions. And I wonder if Pfau's account of tradition might have similar difficulties. That is, at the conclusion of Newman's essay on development, he offers 7 tests. In a later edition, he calls them notes, according to which authentic development can be ascertained. Examples are preservation of type, continuity of principles, assimilative power, etc. However, many interpreters of Newman maintain that those tests are not adequate for the work Newman asks them to do. Newman may have identified the problems involved with assessing continuity between an idea and its successors, but to a number of his readers, a definitive solution remains elusive. Taking the issue to Pfau, on his reading, ideas must have, in his words, sufficient weight and significance not to expire. Or, as he also puts it, ideas survive because of sheer persistence. But one might wonder, what exactly allows those ideas to endure? Pfau speaks of their intrinsic truth being revealed through a rough and tumble, somewhat Darwinian engagement with competing claims. This is certainly a stirring vision of intellectual history. However, to choose one well-worn, but I hope instructive alternative, could it not be that some ideas persist simply because they are useful to those in positions of power? And such individuals use their power to ensure that certain ideas remain in traditions. This is one possible explanation. Others could be summoned as well. The central question is, does an idea's persistence alone speak to its intrinsic truth? Or do we need additional criteria through which to assess its value? I know that Pfau has written on this issue elsewhere, and I would invite him to comment on this question by drawing from those pieces if he likes. But to provoke a bit, we could say that if sheer persistence is the sole criterion by which the truth of an idea is assessed, then William of Ockham would seem to be an eligible candidate for the truth-disclosing club, as aspects of his voluntarism would seem to be alive and well over 600 years after he introduced the idea. To raise a related but distinct issue, if we claim that history plays an indispensable role in the development of ideas, as Pfau does, what gives us confidence in the truth-disclosing capacities of traditions of thought that are so deeply embedded in the unpredictable twists and turns of historical flux? If things could have so easily been otherwise, and if our convictions depend on the way in which they in fact went, can we credibly speak of anything remotely approaching necessity as it might apply to our views? In other words, do we need to posit some sort of underlying structure to history in order to claim that we have not accidentally veered onto a dead-end road in the development of ideas. I am confident that Professor Pfau has some thought-provoking responses to these questions, and I look forward to hearing them.
So thank you for coming here at this late hour. And a special thanks to Billy Junker and the Murphy Center for Catholic Studies for the invitation and hospitality. And also, I'm especially grateful for the refreshingly diverse and thoughtful responses that have just been presented. Naturally, the diversity of these responses won't allow me to respond to all of them in turn in particular detail, but I will try to do some of that, and then the rest can perhaps be drawn out during question and answer. Let me begin by offering a few reflections on the remarks that Professor Kidd offered. I'm particularly grateful for Professor Kidd's thoughtful way of staging some of the concerns of Minding the Modern by way of specific moments in Augustine. Augustine's account of how we came to acquire language, which in a rare case of imperceptiveness, Wittgenstein mischaracterized in his philosophical investigations, actually shows Augustine fully aware of the relational and ethical parameters of human cognition. As Charles Matthews has put it, for Augustine, humans learn language through authority and love, through the need fundamentally to accept what is given as proper speech in a pre-reflective, pre-voluntary way. Yet this authority is not tyrannically imposed on the infants, they actually seek it out, driven forward by the love of others and the craving for their love. A full 1500 years before Wittgenstein, that is, Augustine actually concurs with the philosopher by rejecting the idea of children as self-starting, ex nihilo creators, supposedly entering the realm of language in an entirely voluntary, self-conscious, and intentional way by naming things. Augustine's image of a child cultivating linguistic powers by responding to the loving expressiveness of those around it anticipates his cognate model of theological instruction and liturgical practice. Thus, we can grasp the deeper spiritual import of life only by learning to discriminate between the brash spirit of self-assertion and self-possession and the confessional note of humility that means to put such youthful epistemological hubris into the right perspective. The Confessions thus tell the story of Augustine finally surrendering his sinful desire to be his own author. Or, in Professor Kidd's words, Augustine teaches us to distance ourselves from our own projections. And for that reason, surely he is as timely today as he could have ever been. It is for Augustine the inadequacy of his early proto-existentialist drift, brash, precocious, and hedonistic to the point of unraveling his very reality as a person, which the Confessions invites the readers to accept as an exemplum. Those who read Augustine's great book as merely tracing the sources of his being in interiore homine, as Charles Taylor has proposed, lose sight of this constitutively interpersonal way in which alone our epistemological aspirations can be fulfilled both effectively and responsibly. So I particularly appreciate Professor Kidd's characterization of my overall argument as far from pessimistic and not at all nostalgic. A point worth emphasizing, not least because nostalgia itself constitutes a distinctly modern and irreligious stance. The young John Henry Newman had put the matter rather well when noting that, quote, to murmur and rail at the state of things under which we find ourselves, and to prefer a former state, is not merely indecorous, it is absolutely unmeaning. We are ourselves necessary parts of the existing system, out of which we have individually grown into being, into our actual position in society, depending therefore on the times as a condition of existence. In wishing for other times, we are in fact wishing we had never been born. As I furthermore argue, nostalgia inevitably misconstrues the past as a place of refuge from, rather than as a resource for, our present concerns. Finally, one might add that nostalgia isolates the individual claiming to have superior insight into the state of things from sharing such knowledge with others. Nostalgia is a self-isolating and in tendency narcissistic stance whose proper antonym is charity, in the profound Augustinian sense that entwines the semantic strands of love, community, and grace. Now, with good reason, Professor Kidd draws attention to the culminating narrative in the Confessions, an altogether marvelous instance of communion between the young, prodigiously learned post-conversion Augustine and his humble, yet profoundly insightful and constant mother. Monica, as Professor Kidd puts it, who knows him, who made him, and who loves him. And one might add, who suffered for her prodigal son during his long journey away from and eventual return to the faith she had long embraced and exemplified. The episode, surely among the most moving in Augustine's corpus, impresses on us that unless it is shared, taught, and jointly cultivated, human knowledge remains at the very least incomplete and most likely bereft of responsibility, for we properly only know when we can take responsibility for what we claim to know by sharing, explaining, and practically living it both for and with others. That is, by allowing knowledge to shape us as a community of persons. Let me turn to Ray Mackenzie's remarks. I'm very grateful for Professor Mackenzie drawing attention to the implication that the arguments of Minding the Modern hold for literary study, especially the era of early and high modernism. His remarks on Flaubert make for an apt counterpoint to Professor Kidd's Augustinian reflections. For it is in the world of Flaubert and his modernist heirs, Baudelaire, T.S. Eliot, Thomas Mann, Robert Musil, among others, that we are presented with variously damaged or trivialized forms of human personhood, forms that result when the Augustinian framework has fallen into oblivion. The disintegration of the person, what Eliot calls the dissociation of sensibility, impels the modern writer to oppose the absolute demands of a style to the ubiquitous reign of the cliché, the gravitational pull of cultural numbing, as Professor Mackenzie puts it. T.S. Eliot's Prufrock ingeniously stages this tension as a dramatic monologue, whose speaker time and again registers the repetitive, mundane, and dehumanizing tendencies of modern secular sociality and speech. I quote a few lines here, "For I have known them all already, known them all, have known the evenings, mornings, afternoons. I have measured out my life with coffee spoons. And I have known the eyes already, known them all, the eyes that fix you in a formulated phrase, and when I'm formulated, sprawling on a pin, when I'm pinned and wriggling on the wall, then how should I begin to spit out all the butt ends of my days and ways?" The young Eliot's transformative impact on modern literature, like that of Flaubert some 50 years before him, stems from his ability to achieve a style that arrests and disconcerts the reader with its vivid and unsparing diagnosis of modern personhood, substantially damaged, bereft of expressive confidence, and evacuated of any sense of community. Like Eliot's Prufrock, or Thomas Mann's Gustav Aschenbach, or Robert Musil's protagonist in the book so appropriately titled The Man Without Qualities, Emma Bovary offers a brilliant case study of a deracinated petit bourgeois existence. Key to that project is to dramatize the protagonist's illusion of total control over her life, an illusion that forces itself gradually onto the consciousness of Flaubert's Emma. Yet, as Professor Mackenzie is right to point out, Emma and her modernist descendants are not insightful enough to build up any alternative conceptions for themselves. Faced with the ultimate overwhelming question, as Eliot puts it in Prufrock, that punctures his distracted inward musings, do I dare disturb the universe? Prufrock, in turn, only prevaricates. There is, quote, time for yet 100 indecisions, and for 100 visions and revisions before the taking of toast and tea. I might here quickly add something that I only sort of picked up on as I reread the remarks of Professor Mackenzie while he was reading them out to all of us. And this has to do with the role of the cliché. The question is, of course, the question that is also the great challenge to Flaubert and to most of the modernists I just mentioned and others besides, is whether we can really, and to what extent we can really hope to escape its stranglehold. And it's to some extent, of course, a cultural question, but it is also, I think, a social question, a conceptual issue or dilemma. Is the cliché really something one can effectively circumvent? Or is it something that is, in a way, always in reach because those are, in fact, the only words that seem to sort of be giving us any sense of security? In his late poetry, this one being a passage from T.S. Eliot's East Coker, the second of the four quartets, Eliot puts it this way. So here I am in the middle way, having had 20 years largely wasted, the years of l'entre-deux-guerres, trying to learn to use words. And every attempt is a wholly new start and a different kind of failure, because one has only learned to get the better of words for the thing one no longer has to say, or the way in which one is no longer disposed to say it. And so each venture is a new beginning, a raid on the inarticulate, with shabby equipment always deteriorating. So that, in a way, is sort of the question. Is the cliché perhaps our response mechanism to the silence that would settle over us if we acknowledge the fact that that is the equipment we actually have at hand when it comes to addressing situations for which the available language is never entirely adequate? I do think, and this certainly is part of the argument I've tried to make in Minding the Modern, that this particular perplexity is greatly intensified when we have also cut ourselves from all the traditions and all the expressive riches of traditions that might in fact give us a language. And here Professor Kidd's rereading Augustine, I think, is a perfect example of a writer who is absolutely modern. A few years ago, I taught a course to freshmen, and it was a course in sort of focused reading, just 2 books on the syllabus, The Confessions and Wordsworth's Prelude. And down to the last student, all 18 in the seminar said that they thought Augustine was the much more modern author. I think they were right. Professor Mackenzie is right to dwell above all on Flaubert's misgivings about liturgy and religious life as seemingly awash with mindless repetition, as empty habit. And yet, as Flaubert also well understood, a style as distinctive as Flaubert's, Eliot's, or Thomas Mann's, or for that matter those of Cézanne and Kandinsky in the visual arts, reaffirms the inherently generative force and spiritual import of perceptible forms. Any style, to be recognizable as such, however, also involves a calculus of meticulously qualified repetition. As Flaubert's proto-modernist contemporary, Gerard Manley Hopkins, had noted, repetition is never mindless replication. And I quote, music, for instance, might be regular but not symmetrical, just as the beauty of the oak and the chestnut fan and the sky is a mixture of likeness and difference. Hence, the beauty of any two things, Hopkins says, is not intrinsic to each one, but stems from the fact that one is viewed by the light of the other. Hopkins's sprung rhythm or Flaubert's free indirect style strike me as particularly successful invitations to the modern liberal secular individual trying to overcome its spiritual and aesthetic calcification by recovering a meaningful way of seeing, as Professor Mackenzie puts it. Let me offer a few remarks on Professor McEnroy's comments. Now, in one important way, Professor McEnroy's misgivings about Newman's theory of development, and perhaps by extension my own account, partially premised on that model, are entirely correct. That is, I agree with Professor McEnroy that Newman's attempts at discriminating between true and corrupt types of development remain ultimately unsatisfactory. Yet, in expressing such misgivings, we should not assume that a better solution is available elsewhere. The difficulty of discerning what sets a true development apart from a corrupt one, I would maintain, can indeed be stated as a theoretical predicament. That predicament, in turn, however, is not susceptible of a theoretical solution. Indeed, as I argue at various points throughout my book, precisely this assumption that human knowledge may definitively emancipate itself from the past has afflicted humanistic inquiry with a conceptual amnesia for quite some time, and at this point, I fear, threatens the very future of humanistic inquiry within the university and beyond. So questions of how to relate to traditions of inquiry, how to appraise their significance, their scope, and relevance, their implicit truth, all these perplexities are entailments of the fact that we always already find ourselves operating within, drawing on and wrestling with various traditions of inquiry. There is no outside of that. Professor McEnroy is right to remark on the apparent resistance of traditions to any definitive appraisal. Yet things cannot be otherwise, considering that our quest for meaning, unlike the scientific accumulation of verifiable and often ephemeral information, amounts to an interpretive, dialogic, and necessarily open-ended undertaking. What Hans-Georg Gadamer means by hermeneutics' claim to universality, what he calls der Universalitätsanspruch der Hermeneutik, is precisely not a claim to some totality. On the contrary, it identifies interpretation as a constitutively human endeavor, at once ubiquitous and necessarily incomplete. As Gadamer puts it, understanding, verstehen, is the original characteristic of the being of human life itself, der ursprüngliche Seinscharakter des menschlichen Lebens. There is no understanding or interpretation in which the totality of this existential structure is not operative. Professor McEnroy is not the first to ask whether the sheer endurance of certain traditions and ideas might reflect not their intrinsic truth value, but perhaps the fact that they are useful to those in positions of power. To those familiar with 20th century hermeneutics and critique, this question will recall a fascinating exchange between Gadamer and Jürgen Habermas during the 1960s and early 70s. Against Gadamer, Habermas had insisted on the inherently, quote, authoritarian nature of tradition as a form of dominion, Herrschaft, rather than as a form of cognition, Erkenntnis. And yet, to suppose that tradition serves entrenched interests is to assume, though notably not to prove, that an axiomatically critical and suspicious method of sociological and humanistic critique can furnish a genuine alternative to hermeneutics. And here I would disagree and recalling Gadamer would point out that the well-worn alternative, as Professor McEnroy calls it, of a suspicious or axiomatically disbelieving critique assumes from the outset what it means to prove, namely that traditions are contingent, though often insidiously effective, constructs, that we may yet expose them as handmaidens of dubious ideological goals and commitments, and that an unflinchingly critical method of detached and objective inquiry is precisely the way for us to do that. Against this line of argument, this line of argument strikes me as a petitio principii, as question-begging in the classical sense. For any critical method, be it Kantian or Marxist or otherwise, seeking to unmask tradition as so much ideological obfuscation, assumes from the outset that it can delimit and contest the scope and authority of tradition as just another object of inquiry, rather than as the horizon encompassing that inquiry itself. With good reason, Gadamer responded to Habermas by raising the key question: is critique circumscribed by the dynamic process of tradition, or does it constitute a method capable of transcending the horizon of tradition? To suggest that any acknowledgement, Anerkennung is Gadamer's favorite word here, of tradition amounts to a case of subjection, as Habermas would put it, is to imply that autonomy can only operate as self-assertion, but never as free recognition of someone else's superior knowledge. On such a premise, all meaningful dialogue would be impossible. Here, then, Newman and Gadamer strike me as being in a better position than those following Habermas. For Gadamer's hermeneutic conception in particular does not claim, and consequently need not prove, our capacity for transcending the authority of traditions. Instead, hermeneutics involves our considered acceptance of the authority of tradition, understood as the horizon framing all human search for meaning. Such an acceptance, I should hasten to add, does not betoken some uninvolved acquiescence or a case of ideological complacency. Far from it. To acquiesce in the reality of and transcendent authority of what tradition has to tell us is to commit ourselves to a lifelong pursuit of distilling, parsing, and applying to our constantly changing present the significant meanings encoded in philosophical, religious, and aesthetic thought. Here the twofold root of Plato's theory of knowledge as a matter of recognition is brought home, the term anamnesis being at stake here. A discrete act of cognition turns out to be the recognition of a truth that had preceded it. I had this experience trying to learn math, which was never a happy experience. Where what I learned, of course, was merely to see something that had been long there before, was in fact universally and eternally true. So that's the one element of recognition, and it's one that is certainly always in play where knowledge happens. At the same time, and as such, we recognize the authority of a tradition or constellation that precedes and exceeds the scope of any individual's critical awareness at any particular moment in time. Ultimately, I would say then, tradition is indexed to authority, not to power. The difference being that authority has to be earned, whereas power is something that can be unilaterally claimed or seized, and therefore is constantly addled by the stain of illegitimacy. Finally, let me offer some thoughts on Professor Ahn's remarks, and I think it makes sense for me to address them last because they open up a broader view on the way in which Coleridge's late philosophical and theological writings expose modernity's increasingly confused understanding of education. It is a crisis that, as Coleridge well understood, had been building for some time. Very much in accord with Professor Ahn's observations, therefore, I would just like to highlight 3 ways in which our understanding of higher education, and education more generally, has shifted and contracted over the past century or so. First, there is what I would call, and what Professor Ahn has also identified in the draft of her response that had reached me, the hegemony of the production model of learning, which is basically the model of learning that now defines the modern university anywhere. It is and associated with this production model of learning is the rise of what I would call the neo-utilitarian restructuring of higher education. If you want to see a particularly dispiriting case of it, and I recommend that if you read it, you should have a glass of wine on hand. It would be the Lord Brown report from 2010, which was the report commissioned by the government, advocating a comprehensive restructuring of the British university system. It is really, in many ways, the inevitable progeny of Max Weber's already emphatically disillusioned view of scientific inquiry in his 1919 lecture, quote, Science as Vocation, a fascinating text. I don't know how, I mean, I see there are some of you who are presumably students, unless your faculty is very young. Weber, Max Weber's text is fascinating because, in a way, he suggests that if you want to be a true modern scientist, you should prepare for a life of persistent, if sort of trickle-down ways of unhappiness. That's all there is. Don't look for charisma, don't look for great breakthroughs, just look for procedures and memos, lots of memos. Overwhelmingly, education today is framed as the conveyance of information and its aggregation into various marketable skills. What has largely dropped out of this monochrome picture is the human person as the unique reality whose full realization or flourishing ought to be grasped as the ultimate telos of all teaching. To recall Alistair McIntyre's distinction, modern education has abandoned the goods of excellence in favor of the goods of efficiency. There's perhaps something slightly perverse about the fact that the word excellence is the one that, of course, dominates self-descriptions of the modern university everywhere. Quite shameless. The second, the shift that I've just so sketched, and which I believe has been long in the making, coincides with the systematic devaluing and de facto disappearance of contemplation as the most elemental form of learning. More than 70 years ago, Joseph Pieper presciently remarked on how, quote, the whole field of intellectual activity, not excepting the province of philosophical culture, has been overwhelmed by the modern ideal of work and is at the mercy of its totalitarian claims. This is from his 1952 lecture, Leisure, the Basis of Modern Culture, the Basis of Culture. Pieper's claim should not be mistaken as yet another Jeremiad about alienation wrought by the omnipresent profit-seeking, self-promotion, and mind-numbing transactionalism of modern educational institutions. And we all know what that is sort of about. I think it's a kind of sadly familiar and seemingly implacable a web of never-ending assessments, performance reviews, and overconfident speculation about learning outcomes, perhaps occasionally thrown in the routine meeting about institutional branding. In fact, the loss of contemplative knowing reaches much deeper, and as Pieper argues, can be encapsulated in the gradual displacement of one model of rationality by another, namely that of Aquinas by that of Immanuel Kant and his heirs. Kant, in particular, is interesting because he quite overtly disparages contemplation, simply because it's not enough work. You don't seem to be sweating. So Kant argues that labor alone justifies philosophy. Hegel, on this point at least, concurs, speaking of philosophy as the Arbeit des Geistes, the labor of the spirit, and that labor alone justifies philosophy, and conversely, that one can expect nothing from intellectual contemplation because it costs nothing, because it is effortless. Aquinas, in contrast, insists that virtue, which is the thing we really ought to be learning, consists in the good rather than in the difficult. Virtue, Aquinas says, and makes us perfect by enabling us to follow our natural bent in the right way, end quote. And yet this conception, at once more spiritual and more humane, has arguably been defeated by Kant, his liberal Protestant, and then by now dogmatically secular heirs. And because we have so unconditionally embraced a production and effort-centered model of learning, those traveling that prescribed road, our students for the most part assume that professional success and the upward social mobility to which it serves as a conduit comes at the expense of not following our natural bent. I would wager that the majority of our most esteemed professions today, doctors, lawyers, accountants, are held by people who never truly wanted to be what they now are, and indeed never quite had the leisure to discern their natural bent, and the university sadly was of no help in this regard, and that on that basis were never in a position to contemplate who they were meant to be. Third, and finally, the disappearance of the concept of inquiry as a form of mental action, a point to which Professor Ahn has also specifically drawn our attention. At issue is the possibility, now all but alien to the modern university and its professionalized administrators, that knowledge is a process and a type of mental action whose true significance lies in its tendency to transform the agent of knowledge and to allow that agent to realize her person to the fullest possible extent. Thus understood, knowledge cannot be legitimated as or confirmed by its external fruit, that is, some externally verifiable and readily marketable commodity known as information. As I argue in my book, some of the great 19th century novelists give us characters, invariably exceptional, rare, and favored beings, who manage to extricate themselves from the prevailing dispensation of learning as a strictly calculative and risk-averse, in essence conformist undertaking, and who succeed to immerse themselves in a different, aleatory process, one that Goethe, Humboldt, Schleiermacher, and others around 1800, 1810 began to consolidate under the word Bildung, self-formation, self-realization. Take the case of Viktor Bezov in War and Peace, or Konstantin Levin in Anna Karenina, Wilhelm Meister in Goethe's eponymous novel, or Daniel Deronda in George Eliot's novel by that title. Not only, I think, would any faculty member today at the modern university prefer to have these sensibilities as students, but we have reason to suspect that any student of the other, playing it safe school of learning, would be a happier and, more importantly, a better person if he or she took this, what Hölderlin 200 years ago had called the eccentric path, namely the path of learning to discern the natural bent and then follow it in the right way. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Professor Pfau and to all of our panelists. We do have some time for a few questions, if there are any questions from the audience. I will just sort of call on you, and then you can ask. So, questions? Yes? This one is on now, so here, take.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, the first thing is to ask oneself, I think, and to ask it at any moment that one makes educational decisions as a student, what is it that this education is? And this is a question, so to speaking directly to the students here, it's a question that I think you all ought to discuss with your parents right from the start. Is it an investment or is it a gift? If it's a gift, then I think the one giving that gift, presumably your parents, should properly step away from it. It's a gift, it is only by having been definitively given. At that point, you are responsible for honoring it. This would mean determining your course of study in a way that honors the opportunity and makes the most of it. But to do that, to make the most of it, also requires really searching your own soul as to what is it that really means something to me, that speaks to me, and where do my aptitudes really lie? This is a very difficult thing to come to know. And the only way you will learn where those aptitudes lie is by taking risks. If there is one thing about contemporary students that I think troubles me most, it's their shying away from risks. And I will say, seeing this very frequently at Duke, that the parents, alas, are of no help here. Because I think most of them tend to think of the investment of the educational opportunity as an investment. And of course, when we invest, we try to minimize risk. The question that then arises is, what is this actually for? And I think the idea is the educational process of these 4 unique years is for preparing oneself to live in the most fulsome way the life that we, in the particular way that we discern ourselves, were meant to live it. So it's not simply to get to the next base. It is to sort of prepare us for the life, our life as a whole. What I dread, and this came up at another session on the book a while back at a conference in Atlanta. What I dread, and what I think in many cases I already see, is a world in which everybody is ultimately ending up in a job they never wanted, where I will be treated by a doctor who really wanted to be something else, where my tax accountant will handle things that that don't interest them in the least, where someone who in some way or another will be involved in doing things that sort of set them in connection with other people, will sort of look at their job as nothing more than a means to a paycheck. I think that's the world that, of course, in many ways we inhabit. But if there is anything I would stress, it is this: that if you suspend the understandable worry about what will come after college, and fully put yourself at risk, discover who you are in college, then the decisions you will make will become incrementally more sound, and I think they will prepare you much better for eventually succeeding in life, because the best work that we'll ever do is the work we really wanted to do, not the one that we were somehow dragooned into. This requires courage. It also may often, as I've learned, require the courage to say no to one's parents. If it is done for the right reason, I think it is an important thing to learn to do, is to say that I'm not meant to be the doctor or the lawyer that you thought I was going to be. Children are not replicants. So one has to understand that it's important to sort of learn to have the courage to make those, not decisions, but in a way to make those discernments gradually about oneself. So that would be my sort of response to that. I don't know. Yeah.
I was just going to add my slightly more flip response, which is to say something similar, but I tell my students on the first day of my 101 class, Pursuit of Happiness, that I'm in the business of trying to prevent midlife crises, which is just to say that I think it's important not to get to, I don't know what midlife is, 45 or 50, and sort of stare at your life and think, oh, this isn't what I imagined for myself at all. And I don't think this precludes, I mean, I had to go home and tell my parents I was studying philosophy and classics, which was not terribly useful in their opinion. But I don't think that these kinds of considerations, questions about what a good life is or what's a worthy career, have to have nothing to do with practical considerations. But I think that Phao's exactly right, that we need to be attending to our inclinations, our desires, and our real aptitudes and gifts.
Um, there was one paragraph that this afternoon I sort of cut from my response to Mark McEnroe, which in some ways I think may go to the may serve to frame a possible response to the question. I hadn't seen in the earlier version that had reached me those closing remarks of Professor Ahn to which you referred. Emancipation as a historical category is I think, is often, to my mind, seems to be a case of modernity overselling what it has done. We tend to pride ourselves on having abolished slavery. I think that the conditions of labor experienced by many people around the world are entirely tantamount to slavery. We pride ourselves on having sort of overcome forms of discrimination on the basis of gender. And yet there are entire societies that do that. And they may, in fact, they may find the idea that such issues ought to be resolved according to a strictly Western model deeply mystifying. So the concept of emancipation itself is not universal in the way it operates in the West. The other point, however, has to do with the way specifically that Christianity figured in your question. It seems to me that, and this is where the passage that I didn't read out, that the tradition most near and dear to Newman, that of Christianity, had crucially established itself as a tradition against power, most obviously in late antiquity, and in many ways has, throughout its long history, continued to do just that. So I think the Christian life is always a life in a way of emancipation from the blandishments of power and wealth. Of that word, yes. You can probably run that now, between now and tomorrow. This is not to say, of course, that the Christian tradition has not in turn also occasionally undergone serious corruptions. I mean, think of Dante's portrayal of Boniface VIII, or of Alexander VI, Roderick Borgia, and yet the quintessential documents of Christianity, Scripture in particular, in a way have always sort of reasserted their force. Think of, for instance, Matthew 6:24 and Luke 16:13, you cannot serve God and wealth, or Mark's admonition that the deceitfulness of riches and the desires for other things enter in and choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. There are always ways in which a tradition will be at risk of sort of purloining itself, and yet if its core contents are sound, it will also find a way of correcting itself. And I think Christianity is, after all, the only sort of major sort of development in the history of the West that has outlived, in fact, any political and social system that at some point or other existed. That's what Newman, I guess, meant. Yes. As I imagine some of you also have, been particularly intrigued by just the past year and the way in which a kind of form of political self-policing has sort of run amok on American campuses, but also evidently in England. I just saw a truly dispiriting article about the way things are unfolding at Oxford. There are, I think, a number of factors in play. The first is that a university that tries to market college as a, quote, experience wishes to produce satisfied consumers. An experience, however, I think is a term that is, at the very least, very misleading. And education is not an experience. We are not spectators of our education. We are participants. We are agents. If we are not that, we won't be educated. So an experience, I think, implies a very uninvolved, sort of detached stance on the part of those claiming to undergo it. And of course, as something that universities are increasingly in the habit of marketing very aggressively, because they do understandably perceive themselves to be in a fierce competitive game with many other institutions, the experience is supposed to be as pleasant as possible, as free of abrasion, and as free of the possibility of failure. And that's where I think lies the rub, is that an experience that truly means something is only one in which we put ourselves at risk, in which we risk something, which we take a class, we don't know at the beginning whether we'll succeed in it, in which we might take a class on political subjects where the positions that are to be explored, whatever kind, might be disconcerting to us, might leave us sort of reaching for good arguments and perhaps failing, or where we feel that we don't have enough background knowledge to make a suitably effective counter-argument. And so I think that where the model of education packaged as an experience is really sort of producing some of its worst side effects is precisely in this sort of tendency of some students, by no means all, to retreat into a kind of cocoon of not wanting to be challenged in their opinions, of wishing to feel at all times, mentally and physically, safe. Now, physically, who would want to contest that? But mentally, I think that's where the analogy becomes seriously unsound. I think that that the sort of move to policing dissenting opinions will ultimately bankrupt the university as as a place for robust and meaningful intellectual exchange and learning. And I can only hope that this movement will be as short-lived as its sort of meteoric rise might cause one to hope. But that's really all I can say. I wonder, and one of the things I've sort of asked myself is, well, let's game out for the fun of it what it would like if one implemented this vision fully. How would you know that you had actually been here? I mean, at what point what would you actually claim as evidence at the end of it that you had spent these 4 years here, because you would then have lived in a kind of airtight mental bubble in which people were sort of by various institutional means kept from sort of exposing you even to the very possibility of some fleeting discomfort. A strange wish to, I mean, it's a strange fantasy. In many ways, I think it sort of is to me the most effective way is not to sort of oppose it immediately, but to ask those advocating this form of institutional life to realize their vision verbally, not actually, but verbally as fully as they can, and say, at some point it will actually lead itself, I think, ad absurdum, hopefully sooner than later.
Please join me in thanking Professor Power and our panelists one more time.